Okay, so I'm really happy to welcome you to the next seminar in our series. It's by Yiping Ra. And before we do that, I should say that I'd also like to thank Marla here for the lunch. So the ICCS is sponsoring our lunch and also our Christmas dinner. So thank you, Marla. And today's speaker is Yiping, who's a postdoc student working with David Coombs and me, mostly David Coombs right now, on basically investigating forest dynamics and linking them to carbon release. And Yiping did his PhD in France on individual-based modeling, and he's going to tell us all about that today. So thank you. It's all yours.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, and hi. Does everyone hear me clearly? The people online as well? Okay, so if it's everyone hears me clearly, I'll start. So today I'm just going to basically give a brief introduction about what forest models are, what types of forest models there are, and how we can use them to study forest dynamics, in particular how forest disturbances can be explored. So I think it goes without saying to everyone that forest is very important for the global biosphere and for humans and for everything basically, for a number of reasons. Because they harbor a high level of biodiversity, and because they have an important role in the global biological chemical cycles, for carbon cycles in particular, and consequently they are really crucial they have a very crucial role in mitigation and regulation of global climate. But in recent years, forest ecosystems around the world have been under more and more threats due to a number of different reasons. The first one is human activities that directly cause deforestation and forest degradation. And the second one are extreme climatic events such as drought becoming more frequent or more extreme. And last one are sporadic disturbance events such as fire, cyclones, or insect or disease outbreaks that seem also to be becoming more frequent and more intense. And so the latter two of these three factors in particular, they are important natural drivers in the forest ecosystem themselves. But as they seem to be shifting under the current climate change situation, it is important for us to know what is the mechanism they are impacting forests in the first place, in order to understand how the change might in fact impact forest structure, functioning, or dynamics in the future. However, it is very difficult to study forest disturbance due to a number of reasons. First, because forests are vast in spatial extent, and they are diverse and contain a high level of complexity as well, as mentioned. And last but not least, they are mostly composed of trees. And a lot of trees have a really long generation time. And in addition, the disturbance events that can happen to forests, they are stochastic in time and place, which means that we cannot infer the whole pattern just by observing one or two events. And also they can act over various spatial scales, from the local scale or to the landscape or even regional scales. They can have different effects. And temporally as well, they can have short-term effects, mid-term effects, or even long-term effects. And finally, different kinds of disturbance can interact with each other, maybe accentuating one type of disturbance, accentuating the effect of the other, or conversely repress them. So due to all these complexities, it is hard for forest ecologists to do experiments or to draw general conclusions from snapshot observations alone. So faced with these difficulties, forest ecologists have often had to use models to understand what is actually goes on in forests. So in a nutshell, models formalize the ecological processes happening in the forest in mathematical terms. So that they can include processes like photosynthesis, carbon allocation, or carbon turnover. And with the model, we can test for the hypothesis about these ecological processes by looking at the prediction, output prediction generated by the model, and compare them against observation data, such as those obtained from field work or from remote sensing. And we can also perform virtual experiments by submitting the model to a set of conditions that are different from reality, to see how forests might react in a situation that could happen in the future or could have happened in the past. And of course, it is important to remember that all models are simplifications, and some might go as far as to say that all models are wrong. Although maybe a better term than right or wrong would be good and bad. And what makes a model good depends obviously on the research question itself, on what types of simplification is acceptable and suitable for the research question that we want to answer. And so model design is kind of like a balancing act between making a model fit the observation at a specific site or under specific condition very well on one hand, or making the model general and applicable over a lot of different conditions on the other hand. And another thing to note is that models can also serve as a guide for other types of research. So when we do, for example, we can use sensitivity analysis to see what are the critical elements in the model that control the output predictions the most, so that those can give us an idea on the current knowledge gap or the data gap, and to help prioritize our future work. But some of the models treat forests from a top-down approach. Those are called dynamic global vegetation models, or DGVMs to be short. Their goal is primarily to simulate global vegetation distribution and vegetation structure. So technically, they're not limited to forests. They're applied to all vegetation. And what they do is to couple physiological processes of vegetation, such as carbon uptake, growth, and other types of nutrient cycle, to the global carbon cycle, nutrient cycle, and water cycle, as well as climate conditions. And so they're usually applied at a global scale over a global climate grid. And the grid size are usually between like something like 0.1 degree to 1 degree, depending on the model. And they also often have a simplified representation of demography and diversity, because they usually represent the plant community into just a small number of functional types. And so within each grid, each functional type is treated as a grouped entity, so that they don't have a high level information on biodiversity or on the detailed demography or interactions between individuals, for example. This helps them to achieve a computational efficiency and a better integration with the global Earth system model, but it also means that their ability to really predict vegetation structure and their functioning is limited. On the other hand, there are other models that take a bottom-up approach to look at what happens in the forest by starting with what happens at the individual tree level. So they take into account physiological processes and demographic processes at the individual tree level. This means that you can model individual level interactions, such as light competition or like competition, or other kinds of facilitation directly in the model. And also with this kind of model, you can usually include a higher level of diversity by specifying more functional types or more species and assigning different traits for each species or functional types. And so traditionally, due to this higher level of complexity, ecologists have been able to apply this model primarily at a much smaller scale, at the forest stand scale, which is usually around 1 to several tens of hectares. And so on these four stands, the stand level patterns such as canopy structure, like canopy height or tree density, or by biomass and global and primary productivity, all of those are emergent properties that arise from these individual level interactions. And in recent years, especially, the advances in computational technology have allowed individual-based models to be more and more detailed and complex, so that they can achieve a higher level of realism. And in some cases, even they offer possibilities to apply these models at a larger scale than at the forest stand scale. And within the type of individual-based models, there's a specific type called gap models. So gap models apply the principles of patch dynamics in the forest, and they separate the forest stand into several smaller patches which are independent from each other. And these models assume that within each patch, there is a horizontal homogeneity, so that they only look at vertical light competition. So here are some of the examples of the conceptual representation of these kind of gap models. So here you see that each block is the horizontal position is only for the illustrative purposes. They do not actually consider the horizontal positions in these models. And moreover, a lot of these gap models are actually not technically individual based. They are more cohort based, meaning that in the patch, they group trees of a similar size, similar age, or similar functional type into one single entity. So here you see that this will be one cohort, each block will be one cohort. And they have different assumptions to help further simplify the process of vertical light competition. For example, they could assume that there's an understory level, the ones who are in dotted lines, and all of the cohorts in the understory level receive the same amount of light. Or they can also assume that basically every cohort is kind of like an infinitely flat canopy that spans the entire patch, so that every cohort that is higher than the other cohort completely shadows them. So these are the different assumptions that help them to simplify the calculation efforts for photosynthesis. And on the other hand, there are some other individual-based models that have an explicit X and Y location for every tree individual, so that in these models, not only you have the vertical light competition, you can also incorporate the horizontal light competition, so that, for example, a tree can only be shadowed by the immediate neighbors, which is a more realistic assumption. And with this structure, you can also have representation of processes such as secondary tree falls, for example. When a tree that falls down and die, they will crush into other trees and kill the other trees in their proximity. So here you can see this is the conceptual representation of spatially explicit individual-based models. And so the last point I just mentioned, being able to model how trees are killed in the model is very important, because we know that the mortality process is a major driver of forest succession, gap dynamics, as well as global forest functioning, such as biomass and productivity. Unfortunately, currently we still have a pretty incomplete understanding of how the different sources of mortality in the forests interact with each other and contribute to the forest dynamics. So that in the current development of models, we're often constrained to represent the mortality process in a relatively simplistic way, often with just one or few parameters controlling mortality that are either constant or empirically fitted to different species or different environmental conditions. As a result, some studies have shown that with inter-model comparison, that model prediction, especially for long-term future, can vary wildly depending on how the mortality process is modeled. And as I said in this citation by Bergman and others in 2019, they said it is disconcerting. And we know that it's a bad sign when scientists use a very emotionally charged word, such as disconcerting, to describe the current situation. So one crucial step we must take to remedy this issue is to include the mechanisms directly, the mechanisms through which different phenomena can cause mortality. And by doing so, we could hope to better constrain mortality to more generalizable mechanisms so that they can be applied more robustly. And so, for example, fire disturbance is a major disturbance type in the world. And some models, both global vegetation models and individual based models, have been putting the process of fire disturbance into the model. And this is one example of an individual based model that uses a decision tree with some stochastic elements to simulate fire disturbance. I think it's too small to be seen here, unfortunately, but basically what they do is that they first determine for each forest patch, they have a fire occurrence probability that depends on if that patch has undergone drought stress or not, and which also depends on the observed fire return frequency. And after they use this to stochastically determine if fire occurs or not, they look at the fire intensity to determine if it's a stronger crown fire where all the crowns are burning, or just ground fire where fire remains on the ground. And again, the probability of it being a crown fire depends on the drought stress situation of the patch. So that if there's a crown fire, basically every tree dies. But if it's just a weaker ground fire, only fire intolerant species will die, as well as the small trees of the tolerant species will die. So in a nutshell, of course, different models will have different ways to include this process, but three aspects of fire disturbance should probably be included. The first one is that fire-induced mortality can depend on different species and different tree size. And the second one is that there should be a kind of disturbance recovery mosaics on the larger spatial scale, because each time the disturbance will only affect a specific portion of the forest in space. And lastly, there should be some form of fire vegetation feedbacks. For example, fire can alter community composition by killing off preferentially some of the species, or to favor recruitment of some species after a fire has stopped. And this could in turn change the flammability or the fire risk of that forest patch. And as another example, fire can change the canopy structure, making it more open, and thus change the wind speed that is experienced in that forest patch, and thus in turn influence the fire probability in the following moments. And so these kind of considerations are really important for us to have if you want to have a model that can integrate multiple sources of disturbance. And one case in point is that I just mentioned that wind speed can be an influencing factor in fire disturbance probability. But wind itself can also be an important source of disturbance. They can weak wind can cause just partial damage to the trees, such as leaf damage or branch damage that will not directly kill the trees. But when our winds are stronger and exceed the structural tolerance of a tree, it can cause structural failure, such as stem breakage or even uprooting. And these are called wind throw events, and they often result in tree death. And these tree death events are important because creates forest gaps caused by biomass loss and can trigger succession and forest community change. And on a larger level, they can also consequently mediate species coexistence by creating the spatial mosaic of disturbance and recovery. So we can try to study the question of how the occurrences of wind-induced mortality to trees are related to the structure of trees, to its size, to its allometry, or other biochemical properties. Much like an architect or engineer could study how the structure of an architecture is related to its vulnerability to strong wind or earthquakes. So apart from the traditional experimental approach, such as putting trees in a wind tunnel and blowing it, or using tree polling experiments to see what kind of force is necessary for trees to fall down, there are some newer approaches using the techniques of terrestrial lidar scanning and computer model to create a really detailed reconstruction of the trees of the tree, and use computer modeling to simulate its interaction with wind. So this can help us evaluate tree vulnerability in a great detail. But because of the both computational effort and data collection effort, they're unlikely to be able to be deployed at a larger scale, such as even forest stand scale, let alone a regional scale. Fortunately, this kind of question has been considered by a lot of people in forestry as well, and they are considering this question at a forest stand level, because for them, wind-induced tree fall and tree mortality can represent a significant economic loss. So they have developed a type of model called wind damage risk models, which estimate the critical wind speed necessary for wind throw events to happen to trees, based by representing trees as a simpler geometric mechanical objects, and applying simple physics principles. However, these models have been developed with plantation forests in mind. And we know that plantation forests are in general more homogeneous in structure and have lower diversity than natural forests. So when we apply these models to natural forests, we have to start consider the spatial heterogeneity and neighborhood interactions as well. And this is where spatially explicit individual-based models can be a very helpful tool. And so there have been some studies which integrate individual-based forest dynamics models with these kind of wind damage risk assessment to try to study the effect of wind disturbances, such as from storms on the forest. But most of them still involve temperate forests, and they often only simulate over a shorter period of time, over one storm event, for example, or over a decade. So what is also important is to use this kind of framework to investigate long-term effects of wind disturbance in a species-rich natural forests, in particular tropical or subtropical forests. And that is what I did for the most part during my PhD, and I will talk about this modeling approach briefly. So the model that we use is a spatially explicit model, an individual-based model called the TROll model. And the TROll model basically divides the forest stand into horizontally into 1 square meter grid, and in each one square meter, there can be at most one tree individual establishing, and each tree is assigned to a species, along with species-specific traits that determine its life strategy. And in the 3D environment above the forest, it is cut into 1 cube meters of 3D pixels or voxels. And in each voxel, the light level can be calculated by the overall irradiation the forest this site receives, as well as the leaf density within and above these voxels. So that at each monthly time step, we can calculate the photosynthetic processes of each tree by integrating the photosynthesis of experienced by a tree crown in each voxel. And the photosynthesis processes and other physiology will depend on the species-specific traits. And so one note in particular about the mortality process. In this model, there are 3 sources of mortality. One is a background mortality, only dependent on wood density due to the empirical observation that species with lower wood density will have a higher mortality. And the second one is the tree fall process, which is also stochastic but height dependent, meaning that higher trees have a higher probability of just randomly falling down and die, as well as the secondary tree fall that I mentioned earlier, meaning that trees that fall down and die can kill other trees that just happen to be in the path of the tree fall. And lastly, there's a carbon starvation tree mortality caused when for tree respiration is constantly above photosynthetic gain until all the leaves are depleted. And also a quick word about the code of the troll. It's written in C++ with a design and coding principle that is to keep it simple and stupid. And so the only external library that it uses is the GSL, GNU Scientific Library. The model is open source and available on GitHub, although we're a bit behind in updating the successive changes that we have made within the team to the model. So that remains to be done. And it's also a relatively small model for models that handles for dynamics. The whole code is just a little bit over 7,000 lines, including comments. So what I did during my PhD project is to add wind-induced mortality to this model framework. So in order to do that, among the environmental variables, such as apart from temperature, humidity, and irradiance, I also added wind frequency and intensity. Here, wind refers to extreme wind events that are assumed to be really influential in causing tree death. Also, in order to add the process of wind-induced tree fall to the mortality process, I included the tree fall risk model as a module in the troll model. So here is an overall framework of how, yes.
So this wind density that you have, is that coming from sequences or something like that, or is it just an external variable? It's derived actually from the tropical cyclone best track data. So I'll talk about that a little bit later, because the project just stems from our hope to model how tropical cyclones affect forests. So we decided to focus on the wind component of tropical cyclones. So what we do exactly is that at each monthly time step, we use the monthly observed extreme wind frequency to determine if there's a wind event that occurs. And if the wind occurs, we use the wind speed distribution to randomly draw a wind speed for the whole forest stand. After that, for each tree in the forest stand, we estimate
the wind speed that is actually experienced by the tree crown, which is related to the relative tree height. At the same time, we use the tree fall grid module to calculate the critical wind speed that is required for the wind throw to occur with this tree. And by comparing those two, we decide stochastically if tree fall really happens. So first, a word about the wind speed data that I used to constrain this model. So what I used is the tropical cyclone best track data, which contains a record of all the tropical cyclones in the world, as well as their position and intensity at each 6 hourly time step, since 1981. So for each forest site, basically we calculate the number of cyclones occurring in proximity to that forest site for each month, so that in the end we can calculate the monthly frequency of cyclone occurrences. So basically we're assuming that the only wind events that trigger this module is the wind events caused by tropical cyclones. And second, we also take the wind speed estimation in the database, and we construct a distribution of on-site atmospheric wind speed for each site and for each month. And within that, and so the distribution is fitted to a Weibull distribution, which is a commonly choice of distribution when describing wind speed distribution. And at each time step in the model, we draw a random maximum value from this distribution. So after we had determined the atmospheric wind speed, we did have to determine the wind speed that each tree crown experiences, and this is related to the relative tree height. So here you can see that this is the relation of the experienced wind speed in relation to the tree height, and see that there's a decrease as the tree height decreases in relation to the average canopy height within the 20 by 20 square meter neighborhood. And when the tree is lower than half of this neighborhood canopy height, we assume that it is completely sheltered and therefore not affected by wind disturbance at all. Okay. And after that, we use the wind tree fall risk module that is derived from the forest scales model to calculate critical wind speed for every tree. The original model actually contained critical wind speed for both stem breakage and uprooting. But due to our inability to parameterize well root anchorage in our model, we decided to only focus on stem breakage and not uprooting. And so a really simplified version states that the critical wind speed is positively related to the modulus of rupture and tree diameter, and negatively related to height. The modulus of rupture is a wood strength measure, and it is proportional to wood density. So in a nutshell, this says that when a tree has a denser wood and a larger diameter, but a smaller height, it will have a lot higher critical wind speed, meaning that the tree is less vulnerable to wind disturbance. On the other hand, if it has a light wood density, a small diameter, and a taller height, it is more vulnerable. And in the original model, there are a lot of different parameters and coefficients, many of which we cannot calibrate or estimate adequately currently by field data or any other way. So what we decided to do is to group all of them together into one free parameter, the parameter P here. And this parameter can be interpreted as a global vulnerability of the forest stand, because it is same for every tree. So there are several parts in my study results, but I'd just like to present this one particular bit, which looks at the effect, long-term effect on biomass and canopy structure when we vary the wind disturbance frequency and intensity. So what is interesting is that when we vary the wind frequency, we found no changes at all to biomass and canopy, average canopy height. But when we vary the wind speed distribution mean, which is the measure of the overall wind intensity, we see that as intensity increases, there is a drastic and very apparent change, decrease in both average canopy height and above ground biomass. So this is a result that's kind of unexpected, because we had expected that frequency could also have an effect. So we have two hypotheses regarding this result. One is that because we tested this model at the forest site in Taiwan, which is a region with historically very high typhoon visit frequency. So it's possible that the forest community there has already adapted historically to a relatively high tropical cyclone and extreme wind frequency, so that it is not so that it is less sensitive to more frequent wind. And another possibility is the fact that we have a relatively simplistic model that does not take into account the effect of successive damage. So that in reality, a tree may not die in the first time a strong wind hits, but it can be damaged. And these damages can accumulate over time, so that when it's successively experiencing wind disturbance, it can still experience tree death. But this is not accounted for in our current model.
A couple of point clarifications. So did you compare your model to what actually happened in your forest site?
So yeah, it's hard. I think the problem is that it's hard for us to have it was hard for us to really decide on which parameter we really want to compare to, because we have had some censuses calculating the calculating the number of tree deaths, but because we only know at what time they died, and we can see the condition when they died. So we know that if it's been uprooted or broken in half or just standing dead, but it's still impossible for us to really trace the exact cause of death for each tree. And because the typhoon events happen stochastically on the site, so we cannot really attribute them to either typhoon events or to other causes. So yeah.
In that case, why should we believe your model? I mean, this looks interesting, but it can artifact maybe a bug in your code.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, so I think that for me, the point of this study is that we want to see, under assumption that there is this effect of wind-induced mortality that's happening as the way we formulated it, as the way we assumed it. How would the forest react to? How would the forest react to changes in wind disturbance regime? And of course, currently we don't have the data on site to validate it. But the hope is that maybe at a larger, by applying to a larger scale, we can have some other data to compare and validate it against.
At which point did cyclone frequency become significant? If you increase it more than 2x, would it make a difference?
It's here that it starts to have a difference when it's about three times as much as the current observed intensity. Yeah.
Yeah, there's this wonderful talk with Bill Langer a couple of weeks ago. Shows that some species repeat droughts have an impact, whereas other species repeat droughts don't have an impact. So like
Yeah.
maybe a similar kind of thing could be done, be species specific, whether repeat events have impact or not.
Yeah, I think so, because in the model we do have a species specific allometry and species specific wood density, for example. So there are different species that in theory have different susceptibility to this process of wind-induced mortality. But yeah, unfortunately, I did not include an exploration of how species and how community composition really changes as we increase or decrease the frequency and intensity. So, but I think that's really one essential point we have to look at. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, there are obviously a lot of ways we can hope to improve this model by adding more realistic processes and by finding data that is adequate for us to validate it against. And apart from that, I also wanted to talk about some other perspectives of applying the individual based models not only at forest stand scale, but also at larger scales, such as regional or even global scale. So one approach that has been done a lot recently is to include these individual based models, or at least some of the processes of these models in the global, for example, the global vegetation models, to make them more reflective of local scale heterogeneities. So the 4 models that I had mentioned earlier, they are actually example of this. They are indeed models that are included in the global Earth system models and global vegetation models. And but still, I think they have shown that a major obstacle is our inability to really constrain mortality. And another approach would be to simply take the individual based models and parameterize them to multiple sites across the landscape or even a larger region. And it can be done either by randomly sampling points, or by applying it over a grid, or even a tessellated grid. There are different ways that this can be done. And of course, this will really require significant improvement in computation speed and techniques of parallel computing. And finally, there's also another interesting approach which has been done in recent years. It's a kind of regionalization through confusion with remote sensing data. So basically, what Rudik and collaborators did in their 2 papers in 2017 is to take the formalize model, parameterize it over a large number of grids in the Amazonian region to simulate the successional dynamics through time. And then the remote sensing data provided canopy height map over the same region, and they match the canopy height that are measured by remote sensing on each grid to the successional dynamics to identify the successional stage of that grid. And after identifying the stage, they can pinpoint that they can use the model simulation outputs to also estimate other attributes of this grid, such as biomass or productivity, and in the end create a regional map of estimated biomass or estimated productivity.
So again, how does this compare with something measured through like JEDI or the JRC above ground biomass? Do they match up?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I'm not sure if they have done this. I'll maybe have to check reread their work. I think they must have thought of this question, but I'm not sure if they actually done a validation with an independent set of data. Yeah, but I think obviously with this approach, it is very important to cross-validate other data.
Really, let's say,
Yes.
formalize by using tools,
Yes.
but
Yeah.
nevertheless, we have to
Yeah.
So we just compare also generally, so we can compare. We get model parameters, free parameters, if we
Yeah.
explain using the observation data.
Yeah, and for example, JEDI data could be used to validate it. I'm not sure which canopy height data they use. It's maybe a regional LiDAR, but yeah, it could be validated against the independent LiDAR data. And finally, a quick note on the model transferability, which is a problem we have to face no matter which approach we take. And it's basically the question of once the model is calibrated at one site, how well does it perform at other sites? And what are the data that are necessary to recalibrate it? And this will largely depend on how the different processes are formulated and represented in the model. For example, if the processes such as growth function or mortality function are statistical functions that are empirically fitted at one place, then it means that when we apply the model to other sites, we'll have to recalibrate it over and over again, and that will not be really realistic. And we're constrained with the current observation. So the ability to do future projection is also very limited. However, if we try to make it as mechanistic as possible, so that it represents our current knowledge on general plant functions and plant physiology, then perhaps we can hope that they can be parameterized only by local climate or environmental conditions, or the plant traits, which are probably easier to collect or estimate. And so finally, I would like to wrap up by talk about one idea that I have been kind of forming in my head, just very roughly after attending talks and discussing with a lot of colleagues here. So it's an idea I have of maybe combining modeling, remote sensing, and field data to provide a more reliable quantification of disturbance and mortality. So based on what I have presented earlier, and individual-based models with disturbance modules, probably incorporating fire, wind, and other types of disturbance, they could generate an estimation of background mortality as well as disturbance-driven mortality for any given site. And this estimate can be validated by two ways, either by remote sensing data that capture changes in canopy structure or cover due to disturbances. For example, JEDI is a very high resolution, detailed canopy height map. But because it's only a snapshot information, we have to fuse it with other long-term satellite observations to be able to provide a time series of canopy height and structure change due to deforestation, disturbance, and degradation. And this part in particular would highly overlap with what Amelia Hokong, another PhD student who is working on Landsat JEDI fusion. So here there might be a possibility for discussion with her to see if there are ways to collaborate. And on the other hand, global plot level data such as inventory data from forest geodynamic plots or tree mortality network could provide field measured or field estimated mortality. And this can also be used to validate model predictions. And finally, the mortality estimated from remote sensing and from field data could also be cross-compared to see the strengths and weaknesses of each data source. So this is still a pretty rudimentary idea, and there are points that probably have to be better fleshed out, or points which have already been done, but I'm very interested to see if there are any feedbacks or thoughts about this. So thank you for your attention. I would like to thank again all the institutes and colleagues and supervisors that have provided me with help and support, both in France and in Taiwan. Thank you.
Anybody?
You mentioned the constant mobility data and current observations. I have two questions. The first, is it possible to simulate the disturbance of wind to trees in the lab? At the hydrology lab, they can simulate the sand sediments in the lab. And second question that is it possible to like you mentioned, you have assumption in Taiwan, which has not be consistent with the output of the model. Is it possible to have, say, like an active learning approach where you can actively update your model by collecting the data? I mean, the model does not have to be right in the beginning or at the current phase, but it can update the model as well with the collection of, with the increase of observations.
Okay, so thank you for the question. For the first one, I'm not sure. I suppose it's possible to. There are models which are focused on the physics of the disturbance events themselves. For example, there are really detailed climate models which look at the behavior of wind, and I think there are also probably very physics-based fire propagation model. So, yeah, I'm not sure if that's what you meant, but maybe those could be of help. And the second question, well, I'm not familiar with the method itself, but I think with the constant data collection, especially with some current satellite missions that can provide more and more near real-time observations of forest disturbance. And if we can how to say, align them with known cyclone events, for example, that can provide us with a validation data set that is, or maybe training data set that is more and more complete as time goes on.
I think your point is really very good. I mean, for example, let's say you forecast that there's going to be some kind of damage and the storm actually happens.
Yeah.
You measure using JEDI or other
Yeah.
where the damage happened. Posterior.
Yeah.
You can use the vision to update your prior to like, okay, this is how I changed my prior based on the evidence that I see. So as you get more and more evidence, you can update your models, especially if you have knowledge species or rough types of crossing both on the species, wind direction, so on. So I think this continuous update is really going to be very important to most Earth observations you get. So you have the three things, like the field and then Earth, modeling field and remote sensing. So the remote sensing data is going to be more and more easy to get as we go forward. And so using the remote sensing to couple into the modeling in a way which improves the modeling over time you can't not do it.
Yeah.
You have to do it.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
You mentioned that you were focused on like branch breakage rather than maybe like a tree fall event with the root systems.
Yeah.
And I have some root systems, no matter what, in terms of like these bigger like area burden, large areas. How, based on your understanding of the literature, how difficult would it be to model systems? Like, has nobody done that, or like what barrier would there be to doing that?
I have tried to find some literature on this, and there are some modeling which I think there are some modeling which look at use some very basic root parameters such as root depth or like a primary to secondary root ratio and in relation to the soil properties, soil wetness, to kind of estimate mechanical strength of the anchorage. And I think the main issue is that it's very difficult to obtain real measurements for the trees. And for example, even in the forest scales model where they have this an uprooting component, it is mainly parameterized by an empirical tree polling experiment. So basically, they have real data for this species of trees under this kind of soil condition. If I pull it, what is the force necessary to cause uprooting? And so they have it for a number of trees, for a number of tree species and a number of soil conditions, but it's because it's very limited and very empirical. So it will still be better than nothing, but it's hard to say how generalizable it is to apply at the forest stand level, for example. But I'm really curious to know how better we can to quantify and simulate this question, because root system is really in my experience, really underexplored compared to the above ground components.
Maybe one last question.
So you said that fires were ones that wiped out all the trees.
Yeah,
And ground fires are the ones that only wipe out the fire intolerant species.
intolerant and the small ones. According to their model assumption.
Well, what mechanisms that make certain types of trees fire tolerant? I was under the assumption that
Yeah.
Trees.
Yeah.
What causes something?
So I'm disclaimer is that I'm really not a fire expert, but my guess is that for example, the bark thickness or the chemical composition of the wood could play a role. And maybe also, those are the two things off the top of my head. And maybe
that should be very difficult.
I think there are probably some literature which I'm really hoping to look more in depth into. That really quantifies like what kind of trees are more vulnerable and less vulnerable to fire, because that's basically what historically has been done for a long time for wind as well. They just go out in the field to look at what kind of trees are more likely to be knocked down, and those provide really fragmented but still important information for us to make an educated guess. So I think the same probably has been done with fire as well.
Okay, I think we're at time, so thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, great. We will
Share.
next.